And first of all, I'd like to thank Chris and Jeff for the rest of the ZCON staff for giving me the opportunity to come talk to you guys. So I was hired in January 1986 as a design engineer for electromotive engineering. And I just graduated from North Carolina State University with a mechanical engineering degree. And it was my dream job. My dad used to race SCCA when I was a kid. And he would take me and my brother to the track when we were 4 and 5 years old. So I had racing in my blood from the very beginning. And it was like candy shop for me every day going into work. It's just such a fun job to have. And I realized when I got there that the team wasn't doing very well, but I knew it was just a matter of time because I looked around and I saw what they had. They had their own wind tunnel, and they had their own electronics lab. They had their own engine shop where they built everything from scratch, even their own crankshafts. And in the race shop, they had really dedicated, experienced mechanics and some really great fabricators. And also the people there were brilliant. Don Devendorf, who was one of the main owners of the company, he was a rocket scientist for Hughes Aircraft and an electronics genius. And Wes Moss was a mechanical engineer who worked at Holman and Moody back in the day on the Ford GT program, and also working on NASCAR programs. John Knapp had worked for Pete Brock's BRE team and learned how to make Datsuns live on the racetrack. Trevor Harris was a self-made race car designer and race engineer, and always thought outside of the box. And then Kaz Kasner was a team manager who had worked for the Triumph. He was the motorsports manager for Triumph before becoming the Nissan Motorsports Management. So all those guys had different qualities that all just merged great together. So it all started in 1974. John Nett, Pete's company had closed its doors in 1973, I believe it was. John decided to create his own company out of the back of his garage, and he called it Electramotive. Don, at the time, Don Devendorf was driving Triumphs, and he won his first year. He won the national championship in a Triumph. It was the first time driving competitively. And so in 1974, they both joined forces and started racing Datsuns. And Dick Roberts, who was a Datsun motorsports manager at the time, had some money for him to build this B210. So they built B210 and started winning with it right away in SCCA races, and they moved into IMSA in 1977. They ended up winning the IMSA RS, the Radio Series Championship with it. So then they decided to move to GTU racing, and using the 28ZX platform, which had just come out. And they'd done some aerodynamic testing. Don had read some books on aerodynamics, and they started, this is in Ontario, where they were doing some aerodynamic testing. They'd worked on the inline six and made some decent power out of it. And 1978, they built the car, raced it. 1979, they win the IMSA GTU championship. So the next step was going to GTO, and GTO required a turbocharged engine. And Don and John had been watching the GTX cars at that time, which were Porsches. Most of them were Porsches, and they had like a mechanical fuel injection system, a distributor working the electronics, and a mechanical spring on the turbo. And they were observing these cars running, and they were constantly replacing turbos and constantly blowing motors. And Don remembers watching the cars on the track and seeing all the flames coming out of the exhaust were all different colors. And being the electronics guru that he is, he decided electronics was the way to go to control these engines. And he was one of the first of his kind. He controlled the fuel, the spark, and the boost with this control box. And even back then, Formula One, they started using Bosch Motortronic systems, and they weren't controlling boost, they were just doing fuel and spark. So Don was kind of ahead of even the Formula One guys back then. And he made this as an analog system, using these electronic pieces called function generators. And what they would do is they'd get on the dyno and they would pick points at RPM, certain RPMs and throttle positions, and have these points on a graph. And these function generators would create straight lines between the points, which was not ideal, but it was way better than any of the mechanical systems were out there. And so they applied it to the L28 engine, and we were making like 1,100 horsepower. And so they built a GTO car. But they built one in 1981, and it was like an on-off switch. It had, like I said, 1,100 horsepower, and the car was 400 pounds overweight. And he could put in a lap, he could put in a qualifying lap and be on the pole. But once the race started, about 4 or 5 laps in, the tires were gone, and he would just go to the back. And so they knew they needed help. And Wes Moss had been running GTO cars back in North Carolina, and had talked to John Neff on the phone a lot about parts and advice. And he saw that they were going to Road Atlanta for a IMSA race. And Wes had lived in North Carolina, so he drove down there and met them face to face. Well, they hit it off, and Don and John hired Wes to come out to California to help them build the next GTO car, try to fix some of their problems. And so Wes had a 280Z, of course, drove out to California on Thanksgiving in 1981 and started building the next GTO car, which is this one you see here. They also had Trevor Harris, who had done some work with Don in the past, but they had him design the rear suspension of the car to help try to get the power down better. And the car turned out to be fantastic. It won 6 races that year, and they ended up winning the championship in 1982 with that car. And so having done that, now they're starting to eye GTP racing. And in 1983, they knew that aerodynamics was going to be a big part of GTP because they are pretty much upside-down airplanes. So they hired a guy named Yoshi Suzuka, who was working at All American Racers at the time, working in their wind tunnel. And they hired him to help build the wind tunnel. And so they had also talked to Trevor Harris and got his advice about wind tunnels. Trevor had been in Formula One in Europe, and he was adamant that they needed to build a moving ground plane because he had had some problems with testing in a non-moving ground plane wind tunnel and the results being exactly opposite on track than what they were getting from the wind tunnel. So he convinced them to do a moving ground plane wind tunnel. Wes bought some books on wind tunnels, and Wes and Yoshi set off and designed the wind tunnel. It was a 1/7 scale moving ground plane wind tunnel right there in a separate building, but right adjacent to the race shop and the engine shop. So it turned out to be super accurate, more accurate than anybody believed, and even Yoshi to this day can't really tell you why it was so accurate. So anyway, the GTP program had not quite started yet, and so 1984 came around, and they were talking with Nissan about getting the GTP program going, and so they formed Electramotive Engineering Incorporated, and that was going to be a race shop to run the GTP cars, and also a company that would do special projects for Nissan. And so, and also Electramotive Incorporated kept going on as a separate company, and that's John Neff carried on running that company. And that they started working on the V6, the new 300ZX V6 engine, the iron block V6 engine, and turning that into a GTP race engine, and it was putting out like 1,000 horsepower with a boost and Don's electronic box. It was pretty potent. But they'd also gotten some contracts from Nissan to build a digital EECP, the electronic engine control processor that Don had made, and make it more production, make a lot of them. And the V6 engine was going to be supplied to the Group C cars in the Japanese Endurance Series. And so Electramotive was building the engines, and Don had the lab building these electronic boxes to send to Japan. And it also was going to benefit the GTP program. So 1985, they contracted Lola to start building the GTP car for them. And this car was very difficult. It was aerodynamically unstable, and you know, it was black, and it was sponsored by a California cooler, but soon got the nickname California Coffin. And Don was driving at the time, and he would crash it several times, and luckily escaped injury. One time he crashed, and the seatbelt mount came out, and luckily he survived that. But there was a lot of problems. The engine was had given him reliability problems. The transmission they were using was a Wiseman transmission that wasn't up to the horsepower, and so it was constant problems. So it was pretty much a disaster. And so that's when I came in 1986. And actually in 1985 also, Nissan had contracted Electramotive Engineering to build a aluminum block version of the iron block. And mainly for weight and also for strength, because the iron block wasn't cut. And so that's when I came in 1986. And I remember walking into my first day on the job at Wes was my boss, and he walks me in the door and said, "Chris, normally I'd show you around the shop," and I was itching to see the GTP car because that's what I was there for. But no, we had to go straight up to the engineering office, which is here, and you know, there was no CAD systems back then. It was all hand drawings on drafting machines. And I met a guy named Joe Anahory there who had designed drag racing blocks in America, aluminum drag racing blocks, and aluminum sprint car blocks. And so he had a lot of expertise in how to make an aluminum block work. So for me, I was sort of the draftsman, detail designer of it. And I worked at the direction of Wes and Joe to design the block. And it was all on, you know, E-size paper, 34 by 44 inch, all drawn full scale. Nissan had sent us the iron block drawings, so we knew where all the points were. It was all in Japanese, so we couldn't read a thing on it. But we knew where all the points were. And so I worked on that project for like 2 years, drawing it up, going to the pattern shop, going to the castings, holding the cast, you know, through the casting process and through the machining process. We built the first engine in 1987 and shipped it to Japan. It ran about 500 miles and broke the main caps. And so we had a whole redesign to go through. So it took a whole another year to redesign. We did a lot stronger main caps, and we did some testing on it to prove that it was stronger than the iron block. And by 1988, it was ready to go. It was a strong engine, stronger. We proved it was stronger than the iron block, and it was now an engine that was ready to go. See, that's one of my drawings there in the bottom right, the front view of the engine. All drawn by hand. I believe Wes would use red markers to mark where my problems were, so to fix those problems. But the other thing that happened in 1986 was they hired Kaz Kasner, and he had, like I say, he was a Triumph Motorsports manager before, and he was a really smart guy, but he was hard-nosed. He made some really tough decisions. One of the decisions he made was to convince Don Devendorf to step aside from driving. Because we all knew Don was such a genius in engineering and electronics that if something were to happen to him in the car, it could jeopardize the whole program. So he convinced Don to step aside, and he started hiring professional drivers, and Elliott Ford Robinson was one of them. And he talked to Jeff Brabham. Well, Jeff Brabham wasn't interested. He had seen Don crash the car, and he knew it was called California Cooler. He was not interested at all in driving that car. Well, him and Trevor Harris had worked together in an IndyCar deal for All American Racers at one point, so they were good friends. And Trevor knew, Don and these guys real well. So Trevor said, "Jeff, maybe give them a chance. Go to the shop, see what they got going on, and then make your decision." So Jeff went there, and he pretty much came to the same conclusion I did when I showed up, and thought, well, maybe this might not be a bad deal. So he agreed to start driving the car. A couple other decisions that Kaz made that year is we were running the Wiseman gearbox, and it had been designed originally for McLaren Formula One. Well, they have high RPM, low torque engines. We had lower RPM, high torque engines, and we were just blowing that thing up left and right. So we bought a Hewlin VGC box, which was what a lot of the Group C cars back then with high horsepower were running, and so we put that in the car. And so that helps solve some of those problems. The Bridgestone tires were blowing up in 1987, And Kaz also worked a deal to get Goodyear tires instead of Bridgestone tires. And so before that, we go back up. So in 1987, we thought maybe we had this stuff going on. We were still running the Bridgestones. And they went to the first race in Miami, and Elliott Ford Robinson and Brabham won the race. They put it on the pole, won the race. And but that was the only win we had the whole year. The rest of the year, we were blowing up engines, we were blowing gearboxes, we were blowing tires. So everything was going wrong. Well, during that year too, 1987, Kaz hired Trevor to start working for Nissan. And he had Trevor redesign the tub for the car, the chassis, the main part of the car. And so 1988, that chassis was ready, and when Trevor designed it, it was 50% stiffer than the Lola car. And so we were all pretty excited what that might mean on the track. And everything had started coming together in 1988. The tires, we had Goodyear, the gearbox had been replaced, the aerodynamics, Yoshi Suzuka had redesigned the bodywork, made a lot more downforce and a lot more stable car. It was really probably one of the most stable aerodynamic cars I've ever been involved with in my whole time in motor racing. But all those things came together, and so in 1988, well, they go to the first race at Miami, and the brake ducts were one of the last things that were done on the car. And so we go to the race, and in qualifying, Brabham puts it on the pole by 2 seconds. But during the practice, they'd only run like four laps at a time. And so when the race started, Brabham started the race, and he got a big lead, and about 15 laps in, the brakes started fading. And so they came in the pits, and they were bleeding the brakes, and had just all kinds of problems. John Morton was driving for us that year too, so he remembers it was a nightmare, that race. They ended up finishing 2 laps down after coming in constantly bleeding the brakes, trying to keep the brakes cool. So typical of this team, we go back to the shop, and there was a complete redesign of the brake system. Not only the cooling ducts, but Don did this whole analysis of the braking ability of the car, and with the downforce we were making, he was saying we're not anywhere near where we can use the brakes. And Brabham would even say he would press the brake pedal as hard as he could not lock the tires up. So we worked on making better brake ducting, and also stiffening up the whole brake system and trying to get more pressure to the calipers. So we changed the brake pedal ratio and put in some hard lines where some flex lines were and stuff to get everything as stiff as possible. And so then we go to Road Atlanta for the second race. And Brabham was running the new car, and in practice, and a timing belt broke right before qualifying. So they had to bring out the old Lola backup car, and so Brabham qualified that car because there wasn't enough time to put a new engine in before qualifying. So Brabham took that car, he put it on pole, and the Lola put that car on pole, record-breaking time. And then by Sunday morning for the warm-up, they put a new motor in the 88 car. Brabham took it out in the warm-up and ran faster than his qualifying time in the Lola. So the guys decided, hey, we're going to race that car, we're not going to race the 83. So they had to withdraw the 83 car. And because they withdrew the 83, they put number 3 on this car, which I thought was really cool because I was a Dale Earnhardt fan back in the day. And so we go out, and he starts from the back, and halfway through the race, they come in for a pit, and maybe John was getting in the car, and it caught fire in the pits. I was working the pit board for that race, so I was watching the car on fire with the guys working on it, changing tires and fueling, and I was going, oh no, this is over. And but the crew was so professional and cool about it. They got the car back on its wheels and sitting down pit lane on fire. Well, the wind blew the fire out, so that was the end of that problem. But one of the problems was that they didn't get enough fuel in the car. They stopped fueling it, obviously, because it was on fire. So we kept running, and I remember the last stint Jeff came in, and I think John got in the car before him. He was like 61 seconds back, and he knocked about half of that time down, got up to second. Brabham came in for the last stint. He left the pits 33 seconds behind the TWR Jaguar. I think it was John Nielsen driving the car at the time. And I was working the pit board, and I had 33 laps to go in 33 seconds. I'll never forget it. And as the laps ticked down, the time behind ticked down faster than the laps. So I'm like, oh, we're going to catch him. And sure enough, by about 6 laps to go, grabbed him, caught him, passed him, and we won the race. And so that was the first of 8 in a row that year. Brad went on to win the championship. We won, I think, 9 out of 12 races that year. And it wasn't all easy. There was problems with the car. I mean, the crew worked till like 2 a.m. almost every night preparing the car for the Sunday's race. And we would have problems during practice, but when the race came around, magically, it all just went like clockwork. So it was a pretty incredible year. And we followed it up the next year, 1989. John had a bad crash in 1988, and he stepped away from driving the car, and they hired Chip Robinson to drive with Jeff in 1989. And so we just carried on, and we won both manufacturers and drivers championship that year. And the previous year in 1988, we lost to Porsche by 1 point in the manufacturers championship. We went down to the wire at the very end of the race. They had 4 or 5 cars running every race. We had 1, 2 running at the end. And they got points for every car that was out there. So it's pretty incredible we came that close to beating them in the drivers championship. So anyway, we won that 1988-89 championship, and Nissan decided to buy out Electramotive and form Nissan Performance Technology. And so we were already working on the MBT 90 car that was going to replace the GTP car, or the 88 car. The main thing about that 90 car was it was going to be a twin turbo, because the rules were favoring twin turbos, and the 88 car was a single turbo. And how the car was built, you can't just throw twin turbos on it. It doesn't work that way, so you have to start all over. But anyway, we went through the MPTI and won a couple more, 2 more drivers championships, 2 more manufacturers championships. 1993, Nissan decided, a new guy came in at Nissan North America and decided that it was too much money he was spending. It wasn't helping them sell cars, so they closed the doors in 1993. So when they closed the doors, I kept all my notes, and mainly for my future race engineering endeavors I was going to be hopefully getting into, which I did, and it was such valuable information, and I had in the back of my mind that I might write a book one day on this experience, because it was just awesome working for this team. And so 2017 I decided to start writing stuff down, and I wanted to make sure it was 100% accurate, because I'd seen stuff on the internet that wasn't true. And so, imagine that. So I started writing different portions of the book, and I would send it to my colleagues that had worked on those sections of the car, and asked them, make sure I got everything correct. And not only would they send me corrections that I had, they would send me back more information that I even knew about. And so the thing just kept getting bigger and bigger, and it turned into a book more than I ever thought that it was going to be. And I wanted all those guys to be proud of it. And in the end, when I sent them copies of the book, they were so excited that I wrote it, and super proud of it. So I have books here to sell. I have some here for tonight, some tomorrow. So if you want to come check it out and ask me questions, feel free to do it. And I really appreciate the time to tell you about all this. We got another thing to show you. When John started driving for us in 1988, there was a Christmas party that Electramotive was going to have in 1987, and there was 2 guys that had come from Texas that came to California to be rock and roll stars. And they found in the paper, they found that Electramotive was hiring, so they were racing came bad. They go work there where we work on our rock star career. So they came to work for us at Electramotive, and one was a drummer, a really good drummer named Mike Ferrari, and the other guy was a really good guitarist named Chad Eldridge. And they found out I played a little bit of rhythm guitar, and one of the fabricators could sing and play bass. And so we started practicing in the back of the shop after work. And then somebody, one of the ladies in the front office came up and said, hey, would you guys want to play at the Christmas party? And so we said, yeah, sure, we'll do that. So we came up with about 8 songs. We were practicing, we kept practicing every night. And then John comes walking in the door one time when we're practicing like one night and says, hey guys, can I sing a song with you? And we're like, hell yeah. So he said, I want to sing Jailhouse Rock. So we practice and practice, and the funny thing about it is John would always come in at the exact wrong time. So we always had to slow up on the intro to catch up with him. But once we caught up, it rocked. So there's a video on YouTube that I posted a long time ago, and you can look, if you look up John Morton singing, you can find this video on YouTube.